Today, we are unpacking one of the most fraught and honestly overused terms in modern discourse: radicalization.
Right.
It's a concept that is just everywhere. You see it in security reports, policy papers, university courses. But if you actually ask different experts to define it, you get these profoundly different answers.
And that ambiguity, I think, is the core of the problem. When you look at how different policy bodies, especially in the West, have tried to pin it down, they mostly land on one idea,
Okay.
that it's a measurable, singular, almost pathological transformation. It's a process where a person moves from a state they call normal or healthy
Yeah.
to one that's abnormal or extremist.
So it's treated like a disease process, almost like a chemical reaction that just fundamentally alters a person's makeup.
Exactly. And our mission today is to really challenge that foundational assumption. We're going to offer an alternative framework that's based on contemporary psychoanalysis. We want to understand radicalization, not just as, a policy failure or a breakdown of the mind, but as a deep psychosocial process, a response to very specific psychological and historical conditions that are woven into the fabric of identity itself.
And to do that, we're diving into some fascinating source material, especially the work of Rahimi, which uses the theoretical firepower of thinkers like Lacan, Derrida, and Melanie Klein. This isn't just about politics. It's about the emotional, the existential mechanisms that make these extreme beliefs so incredibly attractive.
Right. And we'll be breaking down some pretty deep concepts to make them accessible.
Yeah.
We're talking about the difference between the ego and subjectivity, the stabilizing function of something called the syndrome,
The Synthhomer.
the psychological drive for what's called the lost object of perfect justice, and the philosophical challenge of hauntology. I mean, these are really the keys to unlocking the emotional investment people make in absolute ideology.
Okay, so let's start with that definitional challenge first. When the EU or the UK looks at radicalization, what are they actually measuring, and where does that focus fall short?
Well, the broad consensus is that it's a process.
A process.
A process where a person assimilates an extremist ideology. But the focus really shifts depending on who's doing the measuring. After the Madrid bombings in 2004, the European Commission focused on the social side of it, defining it as a process of socialization leading to violence.
In the UK.
Well, the UK Home Office later tried to map it as a measurable progression, the specific steps from just supporting an idea to actively participating in violence.
They're looking for that steps on the ladder model, that one moment where the switch flips.
Precisely. They're looking for the point where a regular citizen transforms into a threat. But this common Western model, by treating the radical as abnormal, it pathologizes the process. And the psychoanalytic lens pushes back on that hard.
And why is treating it like an illness or a pathology so problematic, strategically speaking?
Well, if you treat it as an illness, your only real option is to try and cure the person by, dismantling the ideology head on.
Right.
But that approach often fails because it completely misses the psychological function that the ideology is serving. Rahimi argues we have to see its multidimensional psychosocial nature. It isn't just a flaw. It's a strategy the mind adopts to cope with complexity and deep uncertainty.
Okay, so let's get into what that psychosocial framework actually looks at. What are the key internal features of this radicalized subjective state?
There are four key areas we see reinforced by these extreme ideologies. First, the adoption of split thinking.
Okay, what is that?
It's the rigid binary division of the world. Absolute good versus absolute evil, right versus wrong. No gray areas allowed. Second, a profound cognitive inflexibility. A total resistance to dialogue, to compromise, or to any new information that challenges the worldview.
The narrative becomes totally impermeable.
Yes. And third, there is this intense emotional investment in narratives of grievance, victimhood, and injustice. This is so often rooted in personal or collective trauma that the ideology finally seems to explain. And then finally, the ultimate goal: utopian visions.
A perfect society, perfect justice.
A perfect, purified society, exactly. These four things work together to build a really robust psychological structure.
That brings us to the theory. We need to understand why these ideologies are such effective psychological anchors. Let's start with subjectivity. So when we talk about the self in common terms, we usually mean the conscious ego, the independent thinking person. What does psychoanalysis mean by subjectivity?
It's really the opposite of that autonomous ego. Psychoanalytic subjectivity views the self as being profoundly shaped by forces outside of our consciousness.
Okay.
Unconscious desires, cultural norms, social contexts. You're not a self-contained island. Your sense of self is a construct, and it's embedded in this web of language and culture. which means when that social web breaks down, your internal self also starts to fracture.
And this is where the theory provides the repair kit, so to speak. And here's where it gets really fascinating. The concept of the syndrome. Now, hold on. Is this just a high-level jargon word for a coping mechanism?
That's a great way to start thinking about it, but it's actually more specific and more fundamental. A symptom is something that bothers you.
Right.
You want to get rid of it.
Right.
The symptom is different. It's a unique, necessary psychic formation that actively stabilizes the individual's entire identity structure. It holds the self together, especially when that person is facing deep existential uncertainty or fragmentation.
So, if your sense of identity is shattering because the world feels chaotic, say, in a post-truth environment where symbolic anchors like government or media feel completely unreliable, the syndrome steps in as a kind of psychological life raft.
Precisely. Evans, who's one of the key interpreters of Lacan, describes it as the formation that allows one to live. It compensates for all the inconsistencies, the gaps, and contradictions within the mind by providing a durable, coherent structure of meaning.
So how does this link back to extremism? Are we saying that radical belief systems can function as a synthomic formation?
Absolutely. When traditional anchors, like a stable religious identity or a state identity, what Lacan called the nom du père, or the symbolic law that gives structure, when those become destabilized, which is a hallmark of the postmodern condition, the appeal of a rigid, totalizing ideology just skyrockets.
It restores that certainty.
It restores symbolic certainty and provides a clear, unshakable identity when everything else feels fluid.
You know, I find the research from Barak and his colleagues so compelling here because they actually observed this process in real time in individuals who had experienced traumatic loss. It's like watching the syndrome in action.
Yes, their interviews reveal that the radicalization process starts with a binary decision that stabilizes the initial trauma. A preliminary fundamental split between good and bad or right and wrong.
And that then generalizes.
It generalizes to their entire worldview, it defines their mission, and it solidifies the radicalized self. Because the social environment often confirms and validates this rigid framework.
That binary kernel is so critical. It ties directly into why split thinking is so appealing. Why does this Manichaean division of the world into good and evil offer such, psychological relief?
Because ambiguity is anxiety-producing. It just is. Our minds really struggle with uncertainty. When your ontological security, that basic sense that the world is stable and predictable, when that breaks down, imposing a rigid black and white order provides immediate certitude and a sense of control. If I know who the absolute enemy is, then I know who I am, and that chaos is contained.
This reminds me so much of classic object relations theory in developmental psychology. Can you just sort of sketch out that parallel for the listener?
Certainly. Melanie Klein described the earliest developmental stage in infancy as the paranoid schizoid position. The infant manages the overwhelming anxiety of dependency by splitting everything into pure fragments. You have the all-good mother who satisfies needs and the all-bad mother who frustrates them. They just can't yet tolerate the idea that the object is complex.
It's all black and white.
Exactly. Mature development moves toward what she called the depressive position, where the individual accepts complexity, ambiguity, contradiction, recognizing that a person is whole, containing both good and bad qualities.
So radicalization is a kind of retreat.
In this frame, yes, it's a psychological retreat to that simpler, safer, split mode of thinking. It reduces these incredibly complex social and political phenomena into stark, manageable categories to achieve a sense of security.
And that drive for absolute simplicity then culminates in the pursuit of total justice. This is where that psychological impulse meets the ideological utopian project.
It does. And that drive for total justice is tied psychoanalytically to the search for the lost object.
Okay, the lost object.
This is an unconscious, idealized fantasy of a state of perfect wholeness that was irretrievably lost. Think of the infant's total unification with the mother, a sense of absolute security and belonging. Once that is lost, the yearning for that completeness drives all human desire.
So the radicalized person doesn't just want a policy change. They want to restore that mythical, perfect state of wholeness. They project that deep existential yearning onto political ideals, pure freedom, absolute justice, or some kind of racial utopia. That idealized perfection becomes what Lacan called the objet, the powerful, unattainable object that causes desire.
And that is where the danger lies. What's so historically tragic is that this intense pursuit of utopian visions fueled by that binary splitting has necessitated horrific violence.
Right.
I mean, when your goal is absolute purity, you must eliminate anything that's deemed impure.
The source material gives these just devastating examples across different spectrums of ideology, but they all share this modernist logic of purity.
Think of the French Revolution's reign of terror, dedicated to achieving the purity of egalitarian democracy. Think of the Soviet Union's forced collectivization under Stalin, aiming for a classless utopia. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge and its agrarian paradise. In every single instance, the logic of pure totality, that refusal to tolerate any contradiction, resulted in colossal devastation. The ideology promised wholeness, but delivered fragmentation and death.
It's the ultimate paradox. The pursuit of purity demands that impurity be cleansed. So if total justice is the goal, how does this framework help us understand why that goal is fundamentally impossible and what that means for actually helping people disengage?
For that, we turn to Derrida's concept of hauntology.
Ontology.
It's a powerful idea that challenges the distinction between past and present. It argues that historical injustices, suppressed voices, and moral failures continue to haunt all existing systems of law, culture, and social order. They're always present, always demanding to be addressed.
So no law, no system, no current legal structure can ever fully escape the shadows of the past or ever achieve final closure.
Exactly. Derrida says justice is an undeconstructible ideal. It always exceeds legal norms. The force of law can never be entirely just, and total justice is perpetually deferred. It's always a seat we're moving toward, never one we can actually arrive at. And this is the intellectual sledgehammer that shatters the core assumption of radical utopian ideologies, the idea that a final, pure state of perfection can be achieved here on Earth.
Wow. That makes the task of deradicalization sound almost philosophical. If the ideology is rooted in chasing an impossible goal, you have to help the individual mourn the possibility of that goal.
You do, and this is why we have to distinguish clearly between disengagement, which is just behavioral withdrawal, and deradicalization, which is the cognitive and emotional shift that changes identity. Psychoanalysis helps us enhance existing empirical models by focusing on that identity anchor, the symptom.
Can you give us an example of how this thinking actually improves intervention models?
Sure, take the Phoenix model, which emphasizes identity transformation as the core process of exiting extremism. This aligns perfectly with the symptom. You can't just remove the ideology, you have to facilitate the creation of a new functional anchor to stabilize the self, a new source of meaning and belonging before the old one is relinquished.
And what about the ABC model? The one that notes the gap between radical attitudes and violent behaviors, the people who sympathize but never act.
Right. Psychoanalysis helps fill that gap by pointing to the unconscious desires that sustain the ideological sympathy, even without action. The trauma, the need for certainty, the existential disillusionment, these needs keep the attitude alive.
So this leads to some actual principles for how to intervene.
And it translates into actionable, psychoanalytically informed principles. First, and this is crucial, you must avoid direct ideological confrontation. Challenging the synthone head-on just triggers deep defensive mechanisms and often strengthens the person's radical position. It can actually make things worse.
So if a direct challenge is out, the focus has to shift to creating psychological environments that can tolerate complexity.
Precisely. We need to cultivate transitional spaces. These are intermediary psychological zones, like Winnicott's transitional space in child development, or Baba's third space, where identity can be fluid, negotiated, and where the subject is allowed to experiment with ambiguity and contradiction without the pressure of rigid categories. These spaces allow a more nuanced, less binary identity to emerge.
And finally, we have to acknowledge and defend the legitimate needs that the radical ideology satisfies.
Absolutely. The ideological shell might be destructive, but the underlying needs for dignity, for justice, for belonging, for security, those are real. Effective long-term deradicalization must address the underlying trauma and emotional needs that the radical structure was built to contain.
Okay, let's connect the dots for the listener here. We fundamentally shifted the frame. We're no longer viewing radicalization as a simple failure of politics or, a curable mental disorder. We're understanding it now as a complex, almost desperate existential response to the fragmentation of meaning in the modern world. It is the human tendency to seek simple answers when truth feels overwhelmingly complex.
It's the mind's attempt to impose order. And so successful long-term de-radicalization requires more than just tearing down a belief system. It demands the establishment of new sources of psychic security and intersubjective belonging. The final, really profound psychological task is to facilitate a path for the individual to mourn the loss of that unattainable fantasy, the lost object of total, absolute justice.
So the core takeaway from all this psychoanalytic material is the immense importance of tolerating contradiction and hybridity. Both radical ideology and old, rigid modernist thinking thrive on reducing complexity. And that simplicity, as we've learned, often carries the highest possible cost.
And this raises a really important question that builds on everything we've discussed for you, the listener. If radicalization is fundamentally a retreat from the complexity and ambiguity of our hybrid postmodern condition, we can apply this logic personally. What immediate small complexities or contradictions in your own life, whether personal, professional, or political, are you most tempted to resolve with a simple, quick, binary explanation? And what potential psychic cost might that comforting simplicity carry?